The 1936 Mercedes looked lovely, but was a failure. Its bad handling made it very difficult to drive. Understandably, there's little film of that unhappy year in the Daimler-Benz archive. However, help was on the way. A young engineer, Rudolf Uhlenhaut, with a German father and an English mother, had been transferred from passenger to the racing service and was to transform the racing Mercedes. The 1937 Grand Prix season opened in North Africa. Mussolini had recently proclaimed his fascist empire, and Tripoli was to be his showplace, with a very fast race circuit and buildings to rival the German Nürburgring. The Tripoli Grand Prix was the fastest motor race in the world, and the state lottery made it the richest. 5 Mercedes and 5 auto unions streaked ahead of all the Italian cars. The new W125 Mercedes not only had more power, but the great improvements in the chassis had transformed the handling. Korpsführer Adolf Hühnlein was there to see that the German cars defeated the Italians. A newcomer, Hermann Lang, drove superbly to average over 134 miles an hour. This was the first major win for the ex-racing mechanic, and few wins have ever been more popular with the men on the ground. Mercedes and Auto Union had the first 8 places. It was an overwhelming victory for Germany. Three weeks later, there was a race in the German capital, Berlin, with a crowd of 380,000. The already fast Avus circuit had been modified with a wall of death to make it even faster than Tripoli. No expense was spared, and both Mercedes and Auto Union had developed specially streamlined cars capable of speeds of around 240 miles an hour. This was one of the very few occasions when Mercedes carried swastikas. Alfa Romeo had discreetly withdrawn. There were 3 heats and a final, and the Mercedes, with new, more powerful engines, won all 3. Goebbels was there to witness the return of Mercedes. Lang won the final at an average speed of over 162 miles an hour and was presented with his garland by no less than the Nazi sports chief himself, Adolf Hühnlein. Having won the first 2 races, Mercedes lost the next 3. Auto Union had a brilliant driver in Rosemeyer, and he made full use of the powerful, unconventional cars on the Nürburgring. Mercedes had fuel pump troubles, and no one could catch the flying Rosemeyer, who won the Eiffel Grand Prix at a record speed. Rosemeyer and Caracciola were together on board the luxury liner Bremen when the German teams went to New York for the Vanderbilt Cup. Von Brauchitsch and Lang stayed behind to take part in the Belgian Grand Prix. Rosemeyer catapulted away in the lead. Dick Seaman took over the lead when Rosemeyer's engine spluttered, only to lose it when he too had trouble. The Vanderbilt Cup was another win for Rosemeyer and Auto Union. The tourists were not back in time for the Belgian Grand Prix, and Von Brauchitsch, Lang and a Swiss driver, Christian Kautz, raced against a second team of Auto Unions. Mercedes had mechanical problems and Kautz slid off the road. An Auto Union came in first, and a surprised and shaken Rudolf Hasse had his one and only Grand Prix win. By 1937, the German Grand Prix had become the most important race of the year. Lang, Von Brauchitsch and Rosemeyer fought for the lead as the Mercedes and Auto Unions drew away from the 17 Italian cars. By the end of the first lap, Lang was in the lead in a titanic battle with Rosemeyer, Von Brauchitsch and Caracciola. Rosemeyer led for 3 laps, but hit a bank and damaged a wheel and tyre, and dropped to 10th. By the 4th lap, the Mercedes W125s were first, second, third and fourth. Nuvolari in one of Ferrari's Alfa Romeos had less power, but his superb driving brought him up to an impressive third. Uhlenhaut's W125 had Mercedes back among the winners. Towards the finish, Caracciola was first, Von Brauchitsch second, and the incredible Rosemeyer had clawed his way back to third. Caracciola had his first win of the year. Monaco was another epic battle, although Lang and Seaman were away ill. Hasse added to the fun by coming out of the tunnel backwards. On lap 19, Rosemeyer crashed trying to pass Von Brauchitsch, who was lying second. Caracciola was leading and could now relax, as a Mercedes win seemed certain. But Von Brauchitsch saw this as his chance, and in spite of signals to slow down, a furious battle developed. This was not the way Neubauer liked to manage his team. Caracciola put in a fantastic record lap that was not broken for 18 years, but damaged his engine and finished second. Von Brauchitsch finally won by half a lap. Three Mercedes were sent to Pescara for the Coppa Acerbo, with 4 auto unions, to meet an Italian challenge in the shape of Nuvolari in a new, lower, more powerful V12 Alfa Romeo. In a race full of incidents, Rosemeyer took the lead, only to lose it when a tire disintegrated. But Caracciola also had trouble, and Auto Union won 3 races in a row. In Switzerland, Neubauer had everything under control, even the photographers. Rosemeyer lost time with brake trouble, and Caracciola and Lang had it all their own way. Mercedes came home first, second, and third. The Italians moved their Grand Prix in September from the fast Monza circuit to the narrow streets of Livorno. But brick walls and concrete blocks did little enough to slow the German cars. Only Nuvolari got among the leaders. Caracciola won again, with Lang second and Rosemeyer in third place. The Czech Grand Prix was on even more dangerous roads. Nuvolari, driving with one tyre missing, still kept up among the Germans. It was a dramatic race. Lang crashed and sadly 2 spectators were killed. Rosemeyer also crashed, but ran back on foot cross-country to the pits and took over Müller's car. This was to be Nuvolari's last drive for Alfa, and he could not get in front of the German cars. It was exciting up to the last lap, with Rosemeyer getting right back up to 3rd place as Caracciola won again. The last race for the big supercharged Mercedes and auto unions was in the quiet English countryside. The Donington Grand Prix was in October, and the spectators had never seen, heard, or even smelt anything like it as the cars reached 170 miles an hour and leapt in the air as they passed the grandstand. Grand Prix racing had really come to Britain at last. It was a fitting swan song to a great motor racing year, and a last win for one of the motor racing greats of all time, Bernd Rosemeyer. Rosemeyer was killed that winter in a record attempt in Germany. (1938) was the dawn of a new era in Grand Prix racing, with a formula that drastically reduced engine capacity. Many expected speeds to drop, but Neubauer now had an unrivaled racing service that would make Grand Prix racing as dramatic as ever. 220 men, including 2 teams of 25 racing mechanics, were devoted entirely to the development and servicing of Mercedes racing cars. The experimental department did not manufacture any of the components, but absolute priority was given to racing requirements. No expense was spared. The new Mercedes made a modest first public appearance when, in April, 2 cars were transported to the south of France for a minor Grand Prix in the picturesque old town of Pau. For Mercedes, this was an anticlimax. Lang had trouble in practice, and his car was withdrawn. Caracciola was on his own in the front row, alongside an unsupercharged French Delahaye. The supercharged car was expected to romp away from the unsupercharged cars, but it didn't. Auto Union were not ready yet. Unsupercharged cars, like the Delahayes, had slightly larger engines and had the advantage of using less fuel. But on the 7th lap, the Mercedes was overtaken by the Delahaye, and the Mercedes had to stop to refuel. The French car romped home and was first by nearly 2 minutes. driven by René Dreyfus. The new Mercedes did not appear again until early in May, when a team was shipped from Europe to North Africa for the Tripoli Grand Prix. The new formula limited the supercharged engines to 3 litres, and the cars were heavier with a minimum weight. The new restrictions were designed to make the cars safer and to reduce the speeds. The new 3-litre auto unions were not yet ready. It was no small feat, shipping a Daimler-Benz racing team by boat, but no expense was spared. Hitler was out to establish his idea of closer relations with Mussolini, and the British Prime Minister had just completed a pact with Italy. Motor racing was becoming more and more political, and Tripoli was more important than ever as the showplace for the growing Italian empire. Uhlenhaut faced all the problems of a new, almost untried design, and the African sun thinned the oil, and the heat made fuel consumption a greater problem than ever. Drivers are not always reliable guides to a car's performance, but Uhlenhaut had the advantage of Lang driving one of the cars. Lang was an experienced racing mechanic and was to play an important part in the development of the 3-litre Mercedes. Seaman had been brought along as a frustrated reserve. In spite of the new Maseratis, Alfa Romeos, and the hideous but effective Delahaye's, the Mercedes shot into the lead from the start. The new cars were extremely thirsty, with only 1 or 2 miles for each gallon of special fuel. Lang was the most economical with the fuel and went into the lead when Braukic made an earlier stop. Each W154 carried over 100 gallons, and rapid refueling was essential. Lang suffered badly with the very corrosive special fuel. A washdown from a resourceful mechanic did little to help, as the fuel attacks the skin. But Lang had a 3-minute lead and drove on to lap the field and to win by 5 minutes. The new cars were almost as fast as the old, and Lang averaged over 127 miles an hour to win. Mercedes were first, second, and third. For 2 years, the French Grand Prix had been a sports car race, but in July 1938, it was moved to a fast circuit near Reims, and Mercedes and Auto Union had entered 3 cars each. Seaman described the race as quite one of the stupidest ever. 3 Mercedes sailed ahead, and neither of 2 Auto Unions finished a lap. 2 had crashed in practice. The French cars were soon laps behind the Mercedes, which played round together. This ridiculous race was also marred by crowds of Nazis, the football hooligans of the 30s, who had come over to glory in humiliating the French. The German Grand Prix was to be a very different affair. Practice was as dramatic as the race, because the all-important positions on the starting grid were based on lap times. The finest cars and drivers of the day were competing against each other on the greatest racing circuit in the world. The full Nürburgring was over 14 miles long, with a road that swooped up and down the hills and valleys of the Eifel Mountains, with 174 different corners. It was a supreme test of both skill and courage. This was where legends were made, and the Nazi sports chief, Korpsführer Hünlein, was out to make political capital for the Third Reich. Hünlein made certain that Nuvolari gave the right silly salute. Von Brauchitsch drove brilliantly to take pole position and was declared an NSKK Sturmführer. Obersturmführer Lang was second, and a modest Mr. Seaman was third. Caracciola was fourth, and Nuvolari, now driving an Auto Union, was alongside. 3 other new Auto Unions were also near the front. But not everything went according to plan. The start was sensational when the starting lights did not work. But Lang had his eyes on Neubar, and he blistered away into the lead. Bursting out of the south curve, the order was Lang, Nuvolari, Seaman, Caracciola, Hasse, and Brauchitsch. It became Lang, Seaman, Caracciola when Nuvolari left the road backwards. Lang had plug trouble and Seaman took the lead. It was almost unthinkable that an Englishman should be in the lead in a German Grand Prix. Seaman was driving superbly and drove the fastest lap of the day, but when he came in for tyres, von Brauchitsch took the lead, with Seaman following respectfully in second place. When von Brauchitsch came in for his last pit stop, Seaman was close behind. Seaman was waiting to start when von Brauchitsch's car caught fire. Seaman called to his mechanics to start the engine and rejoined the race in first place. With 6 laps to go, Seaman had a lead of over 2 minutes over the next Mercedes and Auto Unions. Meanwhile, to Neubar's disgust, Kuhnlein ordered von Brauchitsch to get back in his car and continue racing. Not long after, von Brauchitsch was back in the pits, but without a car on his steering wheel. Seaman drove on like a dream, and the German crowd showed their sporting appreciation of his great drive. The first time an Englishman had won a Grand Prix since 1924. An embarrassed Kuhnlein explained to the crowd and Herr Hitler that the virtual winner was a German, Sturmführer von Brauchitsch. Italy was the motor racing country between the wars, with dozens of races in many different parts of the country. The Montenero circuit at Livorno was one of the most popular. And in 1938, the Mercedes team took time off between Grand Prix races for 2 Italian races. Novolari had won here 5 times, and it was a showplace for Italian cars, with Count Trossi in a 3-litre Maserati and Farina in a 12-cylinder Alfa Romeo that matched the speed of the Mercedes. It was a tough circuit and a tough race with many failures. Von Brauchitsch was disqualified for receiving unwanted assistance, and Lang won again, with Farina second. A week later, the Mercedes team moved across to Pescara, and again Caracciola won, with Farina in an Alfa in second place. Seaman was in pole position when Mercedes ran 4 cars at Bern in the Swiss Grand Prix. Seaman led the race in the wet for 10 laps, and then Caracciola proved that he'd lost none of his skill as the rainmaster. Seaman wisely held second place on his first drive since the ring and finished just 26 seconds behind Caracciola. Early in 1938, Hitler had annexed Austria, and the Grossglockner hill climb, alone in Austria on the map, became the major event in the German Hill Climb Championship. It was on the 28th of August, but the weather was poor and got worse. Two large 1937 Grand Prix Mercedes had been specially prepared for Lang and von Brauchitsch. But it was Stuck in a 6-litre Auto Union who won both heats, both in the dry and in the damp. The incredibly thorough Mercedes team were early at Monza, testing for the Italian Grand Prix. Uhlenhaut was proving a fine driver in his own right, but too valuable to risk racing. He was, however, a huge advantage as a test driver. The Italian Grand Prix was another disaster for Mercedes, and another win for Nuvolari and Auto Union. The last great race of the year was in England and had been scheduled for October the 1st and then cancelled. But after the Munich agreement of the 30th of September, the Donington Grand Prix was reinstated. Uhlenhaut was again testing. 4 Mercedes and 4 Auto Unions faced 2 French Delahaye's, 1 Maserati, and an assortment of privately owned British cars. Dick Seaman was chosen to escort His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent. Hohenlein had disguised himself as an English gentleman. The race was an awe-inspiring demonstration of German engineering. The British cars were driven with great courage, but were pathetically inadequate and were lapped time after time. There was drama when oil was spilt on the track, but Nuvolari was almost the only one not to be affected. Hasse crashed badly and was out. Seaman lost a lap and a place. It was Nuvolari's day, and although he lost his lead at one point, he raced back through the field to score one of his finest victories. In 1939, the German economy was on a war footing, with absolute priority given to vital war production. All private car production was severely limited. War had been postponed by the Munich Agreement, and Hitler made full use of the extra time. Dr. Kissel, the chairman of Daimler-Benz, proclaimed that the factories are fully occupied with army and state orders. Surprisingly, in a Daimler-Benz film of the time, we find that the racing department was kept busier than ever. Nazi officials considered it as effective to spend money on motor racing as on guns and tanks. New Mercedes with improved aerodynamics were being developed to battle with Auto Union for the glory of the Third Reich. 19 of the 1938 engines were still serviceable, but new engines were needed for 1939, with comprehensive redesign and more emphasis on improving reliability. There was a vast engine testing program with 220 men working in the experimental department. 2-stage superchargers had already proved more efficient and could produce more power than the 1938 single-stage blowers. But more work was needed before the new engines would be ready for racing. In spite of all the military pressure, Hitler was out to prove that German automobile engineering was supreme, and time and money was found to fit one of the latest engines in a specially built car to break speed records. The Nazi chief of motorsport, Korpsführer Adolf Hühnlein, had stated that he wanted a German car that was the fastest on land, and with a German driver to take the record on German soil. Mercedes had already taken class records for large cars on the Frankfurt-Darmstadt motorway, and in 1939, another motorway near Leipzig was widened and specially prepared for higher speeds and further record breaking. British cars and drivers had dominated the land speed record for many years, and John Cobb and George Easton had recently driven at over 350 miles an hour in America, but that was on salt flats. In 1938, Caracciola had already driven at over 270 miles an hour on a German motorway, which was the highest speed recorded on any public road. Although Lang had done earlier testing, Caracciola insisted on driving and that he was still the #1 Mercedes driver. Caracciola reached nearly 250 miles an hour with the 3-liter engine and kept his place in the record books as the fastest ever driver on a public road. Class records were shattered and work went ahead on a land speed record car with the Mercedes Aero engine that was to be the great attraction of a German speed week in 1940. But sadly, that was to become one of the great might-have-beens of history. The Italian Empire in North Africa was the exotic setting for the first major Grand Prix of 1939. An Italian state lottery made the Tripoli Grand Prix one of the richest races in the world, the Corsa dei Milioni, the race of millions. For 4 years, German cars had dominated the event. But this year, the Italians moved the goalposts and excluded the 3-liter Mercedes by limiting the engine size to 1.5 liters, the engine size of many Italian racing cars. But astonishingly, in complete secrecy, Mercedes had produced 2 mini Mercedes, the W165. Before Marshal Balbo's flag had fallen, the Mercedes had taken the lead, and they led the field from start to finish. The 28 Italian Alfa Romeos and Maseratis were all left struggling behind. These lovely little Mercedes never raced again, but in their first and only race, they dominated the field. Lang led from the start, and when Caracciola took second place after 5 laps, the race was virtually over. Lang was less than 5 miles an hour slower than in the bigger car in the previous year. It was an astonishing triumph in every way. The first major German race for the new W154s was the Eifel Grand Prix on the Nürburgring on the 21st of May. This was the first of the year's titanic battles between Mercedes and Auto Union. At the start, Nuvolari and Lang were on the front row. Lang was now on top of his form, and in spite of a tire change, went on to beat Nuvolari by 11 seconds. There were 4 special Mercedes for the Kallenberg Hill climb, and Auto Union were strong competitors with a new rising star, Hermann Muller. Muller won the first heat, but again Lang pulled it off and won by less than a second on overall times. The Belgian Grand Prix was on the very fast Spa circuit. Nuvolari and Caracciola both went off the road in torrential rain. Seaman, driving brilliantly, was in the lead, with Lang 28 seconds behind, when he crashed and subsequently lost his life. It was a joyless win for Lang, who scored his 5th Mercedes Grand Prix win of the season. The last German Grand Prix before the war was one of the toughest and most exciting. Even the changeable weather added to the drama. And the Graf Zeppelin was overhead to help the film crews. With 3 cars on the front grid, it promised to be another great Mercedes victory. But Auto Union had 5 cars and were well up and almost as fast. Lang blasted away at the start and finished his first lap leading by 27 seconds. But there was an Italian Maserati among the leaders, driven by Paul Pietsch. And to the horror of the German crowd, when Lang pulled in for a plug change, it was the Italian Maserati that took the lead. The weather was treacherous, with wet and dry conditions which were upsetting engines as well as drivers. For a time, Nuvolari took the lead, but this was one of Caracciola's great days. Many thought Caracciola had had his day, but he was in his element, and his 20th lap was the fastest of the race. And he went on to win, with Müller only a minute behind, after over 4 hours. Only 2 German cars finished out of the 9 that started. Caracciola had won his last and 6th German Grand Prix. The Nazi Sports Organization arranged for the 1939 German Hill Climb Championship to be decided on the Grossglockner Pass in the Austrian Tyrol on the 6th of August. Hitler had invaded Austria in 1938, and this comparatively unimportant motoring event had once again been given special significance to emphasize that Austria was now part of a greater Germany. No expense was spared, and the event was given the full film treatment, and 4 Mercedes had been specially prepared for Lang and von Brauchitsch. They were up against von Stuck and Müller. But there is little film of the auto unions, for this is, after all, a Mercedes film. Lang and von Brauchitsch had the choice of the big 1937 cars or the later 3 liters, and they both chose the bigger cars. The drivers were offered twin rear wheels, but both decided the road was too narrow and the corners too sharp. The Mercedes had been modified to save the weight of a water-filled radiator on the front wheels. Behind each driver was a radiator filled with glycol, and a carefully calculated quantity of water was boiled away. The steam can be seen as the engines are cooled. Lang was on the top of his form, but astonishingly, his first climb was a whole second slower than Müller in the Auto Union. Brauchitsch followed the reigning champion, Stuck, who had been half a second slower than Lang on the 8-mile-long course. It was a brilliant and courageous demonstration by all. Brauchitsch drove with all his usual flair, but was 18 seconds slower than the reigning champion, Stuck. Then it began to rain, and the mist rolled down the mountains as the cars came down for the second run. The conditions got worse and worse up the mountain. This was Lang's year, and he proved his skill and courage by beating Stuck by nearly 4 seconds under appalling conditions. For the first time for years, Stuck lost the German Hill Climb Championship, and it went to Lang. The last race for the Silver Arrows was on the streets of Belgrade in Yugoslavia. Only a few days ago, Poland had been invaded, and in less than 2 years' time, German tanks will be rumbling along these streets, and thousands of Yugoslavs will be murdered in cold blood by the Nazis. The Mercedes and Auto Union teams were already in Belgrade, and although war was imminent, Hunlein had ordered the Germans to stay on and race. Kuhnlein wanted the race to be a frightening demonstration of German expertise. The only opposition came from a slow, solitary Bugatti. Von Brauchitsch had been fastest in practice and took the lead from the start, with Lang close behind. Von Brauchitsch drove brilliantly on this slippery, cobbled circuit. For a time, Lang closed up, but had to retire with glass in his eye after a stone from Von Brauchitsch shattered his goggles. This was to be Von Brauchitsch's great chance, but he overdid it and spun. The auto unions then took over. For a time, it looked like a certain auto union victory, but tyres punctured, and a quick pit stop put Von Brauchitsch back within seconds of Nuvolari. This was not exactly what Kuhnlein wanted. The last race of the Silver Arrows was a German victory, but the winner was a small, lively Italian, Tazio Nuvolari, one of the greatest drivers of all time. (1939) had been a Mercedes year. They had won 6 of the 8 Grand Prix races, and a last wartime celebration marked the end of a great period of motor racing. In 1939, a Heinkel fighter was fitted with a Daimler-Benz 601 aircraft engine and attained a first absolute speed record for Germany. A month later, a similar DB601 engine was used to take the record up to 469 miles an hour, which remained unbeaten for 30 years. DB601 engines were fitted to thousands of Messerschmitt fighters. Much of the wartime history of Daimler-Benz is still hidden and not relevant to motor racing. But the works at Untertürkheim, where the racing cars had been built and developed, became the center for the development of the DB601 engines. These engines played a major part in the war, and Daimler-Benz had factories scattered over Germany and Eastern Europe, where tens of thousands of men and women, including foreign slave workers, were thrown on a massive scale into the battle to produce aero engines for the Luftwaffe and for tanks. Untertürkheim, with its highly skilled staff working on research and development, became a prime target for the Royal Air Force.